of the other big stories that happened last week was the fact that NASCAR won the key appeal in the antitrust lawsuit filed by 2311. Of course, we need to bring in our NASCAR Insider Bob Pockrass, of course, for some insight into this story.
What does all this mean, Bob?
Well, it means that 2311 and Front Row Motorsports could be racing as open teams as early as Atlanta. Not sure that it will come that early, but remember back in December, the teams were like, hey, there's a clause in the charter agreement that says we won't sue NASCAR. So they asked the judge to force NASCAR to let them sign the charter agreement, but waive that clause that they won't sue because they want to obviously continue with the lawsuit. The U.S. Court of Appeals last week said there's no basis in antitrust law to say that this clause is illegal. And so they kind of tossed out the injunction.
So, Bob, if these teams do run as open teams next year, how much does that hurt them both on the track and financially?
Well, Denny Hamlin told us for a 3-car team, you're talking tens of millions of dollars. And from what I can tell, depending on your sponsorship, it impacts your overall revenues as a race team by 30 to 50%. But the big thing is that you have to race your way in every week. And that might not be a big deal every week, but it's a pretty big deal when it comes to the Daytona 500 and you're trying to race your way in.
Bob, how likely is this thing to actually go to trial in December? and what is that going to look like for us?
You're asking me to try to predict a super speedway winner here, Mamba.
Yeah. Well, you're pretty good at it. Come on now.
Well, so most of these types of cases settle, but both sides in this case, Michael Jordan and 2311 in Front Row and NASCAR and Jim France, they've got their heels dug in a little bit. And the courts have advised them to mediate, which they have to do, but they've been urged to try to settle. But NASCAR has said they are not going to redo this charter agreement because a couple of teams of the 15 organizations are suing them. So we'll see how some more decisions occur before December, but you could be looking at a 2-week jury trial in December.
So when you hear the chatter in the garage, we've heard Denny Hamlin talk, and it's not affecting. They've talked to their employees, but I mean, it has to affect them in a certain way with the uncertainty of everything that they have going on. I mean, they haven't. I don't think they've run like we expect them to run from a 2311 standpoint. I know Denny Hamlin is winning at Joe Gibbs Racing, but do you feel like it's affecting them off the racetrack?
I think it's certainly in the back of their minds. As many times as you can tell employees that, hey, you're going to be taken care of, if they know that your revenues are going to be less than what you would expect them to be, it's going to make them wonder. Bubba Wallace isn't signed yet for next year. And, while you would think he wants to stay at 2311, if they don't have charters, what should he look somewhere else? So I think it just adds an unnecessary distraction, and it certainly, I think, can impact a driver. It can impact an organization as a whole. Now, as far as their sponsors, they seem to feel confident that they can keep their sponsors. But again, if there's a chance you can miss the Daytona 500, I wouldn't want to be the one making that call to the sponsor trying to explain that one.
Bob, this has been such a deeply layered case. Obviously, we've been covering this for months now. How do you think this could change the charter system going forward, or do you think that it will?
I mean, it could. Look, NASCAR has said that they'd be willing to just get rid of the charter system. They felt like they did the teams, I don't say a favor, but they felt like they worked with the teams to put the charter system in place to give them more guaranteed revenue so that they could go out and get more sponsors, so they could get more investors. And they view this challenge as a challenge to their entire system, as a challenge to maybe some of their goodwill efforts to work with the teams. And they'd be willing to walk away from the charter system. Now, do I think that'll happen? No, but that's something that they've put on the table. And certainly that is something that could impact all the teams, not just 2311 and Front Row.
So it's all about, this thing is all about money, right, Bob? It's what we're always it's always about money. So what happened if the teams have to go non-chartered racing, right? We know that the money is different for that, and then they win the case later. Do they then get the money back later? Does it go in like escrow? Like, does it go in the ether? Where does that money go?
Well, that's, depending on whichever side wins the case, you would expect there to be some monetary damages. If 2311 and Front Row win and they've raced as open teams, you would think NASCAR would owe them some funds. If NASCAR wins, could they ask for some funds back from 2311 and Front Row? That's certainly possible. But right now, when you get to either later this month or next month, when those teams are expected to have to be open teams, we haven't heard yet from NASCAR what they're going to do with the money, whether they will put in escrow, whether they'll start distributing some of it to the other teams or not.
When we talk about all this, it's really intriguing to me because, Bob, you keep referring to Front Row. Everybody else just talks about 2311. Mm-hmm. Do you feel how do you feel like the Front Row piece of it? I feel like they're almost tagging along and aren't even really a part of the decisions. How do you see that working with this whole process? Because everybody just refers to 2311 unless they're really ingrained into it like you are.
Right, because look, 2311, Michael Jordan, you feel like that they're the ones kind of leading the charge here, and I think for all intents and purposes they are. But Front Row owner Bob Jenkins, he's a restaurant owner. He has lots of businesses, and I think he just feels like that he has invested so much money in the sport. Right, I would estimate that he has put in an mid 8-figure investment in the sport since he started into his teams. His teams typically are in the they're not making money during many of their seasons. So I think he just felt like he wanted maybe a little bit better deal. I think maybe just the way the negotiations went kind of potentially rubbed them the wrong way, and they feel like that for somebody who has invested in the sport as much and for as long as they have to kind of just get to where they are now, that they felt like they wanted something a little better than what they saw in the charter agreement.
So where are the rest of the teams in this? I felt like Brad Keselowski's. Yeah, but they are Switzerland. But I thought that Brad's comments in the media center this weekend were somewhat intriguing when he answered that question. I get the feeling that some of the other teams are involved but want to be Switzerland.
Well, exactly, because in the district court the judge who would preside over the trial, has asked both 2311 Front Row and NASCAR to explain to him why the other team shouldn't be parties in this case, because all the decisions in this case could heavily impact the race teams. Now, the Race Team Alliance has put in the court filings that the teams do not want to be part of this. They don't feel they should be part of it, partly because the charter agreement requires that if there's a dispute, that go to arbitration and not be in the legal system. But the other big thing, Kevin, is that NASCAR is subpoenaing the teams for some financial information so that they can have that info at trial. And the teams certainly don't want to open up their finances to NASCAR. And I would think that if NASCAR goes to court to compel the teams to give them that information, that could push them a little bit more over to the 2311 and Front Row side.
Okay, so what is the next step? What happens here? Because you obviously have been following this for quite some time. What can we expect now?
I think you can expect by the end of next week for the teams to ask for the entire appeals court to hear it. It's initially heard by a 3-judge panel. It could be heard by all the judges. Typically, when you lose a decision 3-0, you don't get all the judges really wanting to hear it, but sometimes in a high-profile case they will. And then the vacating of the injunction, that goes into effect 7 days after that decision of whether the appeals court to hear it or if they do hear it, then after they make their ruling, it goes into effect. So you're talking at least another couple of weeks before we know if they're open teams. And there's also another hearing on June 17th, where the teams and NASCAR will be back in district court talking about whether the other team should be involved and some other issues in the case.
Okay, we'll continue to follow this story and see what June 17th will bring. Bob, thank you so much for your insight and expertise. We appreciate you joining us here on Happy Hour today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Bob.